The year of 1968 was a year of turmoil in U.S. history. Two powerful leaders of the civil rights movement were assassinated. The United States ultimately took a loss in the war in Vietnam, and riots throughout the country shattered the nation.
April 4th, 1968, at 6:05 p.m. at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Martin Luther King Jr. was a minister who led the civil rights movement for African Americans. Most of his movements were peaceful marches and encouraging speeches. One of his most famous speeches was his I Have a Dream speech given on August 28, 1963. This occurred during the March on Washington at the Lincoln Memorial to over 250,000 of his followers. After his assassination, his followers, lacking their peaceful leader, began to riot, bringing chaos to America. These riots took place in over 125 cities, including Washington, D.C., Boston, Chicago, Detroit, and Baltimore. These riots are the cause for 39 to 46 deaths in the days after King's assassination. There were 700 fires lit in D.C. due to these riots, which ultimately caused 6 more deaths and 350 people injured. As these riots grew bigger and stronger, President Lyndon Johnson sent nearly 15,000 National Guard troops in 36 cities, including D.C., Chicago, and Maryland. One riot that had an extremely negative impact on America was the riot in Chicago, which became known as the Night Chicago Burned. The day following King's death, the west side of Chicago experienced a 28-block stretch of rioters. Buildings were set on fire, stores were looted, and their windows were shattered. Within a 6-hour period, there were 36 major fires, resulting in all Chicago's firefighters reporting for duty. The next day, there was a curfew on the city for anyone under 21. Streets were closed, and there were no more sales of guns. Just 2 days after King's death, 10,500 police, 6,700 National Guard troops, and 5,000 Army troops were sent to control the city. They were instructed to shoot and kill any arsonist or looter around in the city. The night Chicago burned shattered the nation as more and more people witnessed the violence shaping America.
Just 2 months after the assassination of Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy, also known as Bobby, was shot at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, California. Robert died later that night after being transported to the Good Samaritan Hospital. Many people recognize the name Kennedy from Robert's brother John. Just like his brother Robert, aspired to be the President of the United States. Robert Kennedy was an appointed Attorney General by his brother soon after JFK was elected president. His role as Attorney General was to stop and prevent organized crime and also work for civil rights for African Americans. Robert also served as a senator where he supported the minorities and didn't support escalation in the war in Vietnam. Robert Kennedy took after his brother and began to run for Democratic presidential nomination. After winning the California primary, Kennedy's journey and presidential hopes were stopped as he was shot and killed by Sirhan Sirhan. Robert's assassination led many Americans to believe that the violence in America was a permanent thing, and they began to lose hope in their country. The American people began to think that change was impossible after the 2 people who did nothing but fight for them were killed for their effort. Many believe that if Robert had lived, he would have been elected president, which would have led to us pulling out of Vietnam earlier than we did. Therefore, Robert's assassination caused more deaths in Vietnam and elongating the civil rights movement in American history.
Just look round, he's gone. Didn't get along
As well as the assassinations shattering the nation, the war in Vietnam played a huge role in doing so as well. The war in Vietnam was a very controversial subject in the 1960s. Many people thought we were there for no reason and should bring our troops back home, while others thought escalation was necessary. The media became more prevalent in American societies, which made more coverage of the war accessible to the people back home. One event that had a large impact on the American society was the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was a surprise attack by the Viet Cong and NVA against cities in South Vietnam, including their capital, Saigon. One place they attacked which left a detrimental effect on the people back home was the attack on the U.S. Embassy. The pictures the media had taken left the American public to believe that we were losing the war, even though the Viet Cong and the NVA suffered more casualties. The public was under the impression, due to these pictures, that defeat was near, so they protested and demanded for the withdrawal of American troops. Due to this event, many more Americans began to lose hope for the U.S. as they seemed to be losing a war that people believed they shouldn't be fighting in anyways. This event led to more anti-war riots and protests throughout the country, causing even more chaos to come about in the United States.
One anti-war protest was at the Democratic National Convention. After the assassination of MLK and Robert Kennedy, the people of the United States were in a violent and vulnerable state. The Democratic National Convention was held in Chicago, August 26 to August 29, 1968. The purpose of this convention was to elect a new Democratic presidential candidate following President Lyndon Johnson's announcement that he wouldn't run for a second term. Kennedy was the leader of the Democratic Party prior to his assassination. The Democratic Party was split between war and anti-war supporting views. Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's vice president, won the candidate spot, then lost the election to President Nixon. During the convention, anti-war protest groups such as the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, Youth International Party, and Students for a Democratic Society had planned to protest during the convention. In all, 10,000 protesters faced 23,000 National Guard troops. This protest turned violent when a policeman began to beat a protester who lowered the American flag. From then on, the violence was unstoppable. Policemen were beating and severely gassing the protesters. Exactly 5 years after Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech was given, the Battle of Michigan Avenue broke out. News channels broadcasted this riot as they were already there for the convention. They reported cops beating protesters, doctors who were assisting the wounded, and even the media crews themselves. Their riots created even more chaos for the American public, caused even more deaths to our civilians, and created even more tension to arise in the United States.
When traumatic things happen to a country, their people need time to grieve about the situation. But the year of 1968 was filled with so much travesty, the people couldn't recover from one event before another would happen. Just 2 months following the death of Martin Luther King Jr., another advocate of the civil rights movement and potentially the Democratic candidate Robert Kennedy was killed as well. Along with that, hundreds of riots broke out throughout the country concerning the war in Vietnam, the upcoming election, and the ongoing civil rights movement. 1 year is a small amount of time for all of this to occur, which ultimately makes the year of 1968 to be one of the most tumultuous years in American history.